like to talk about domestic violence in the NFL, corporate social responsibility, through the way of looking at how the NFL handles instances of domestic violence that are perpetrated particularly by players. Throughout this presentation, I'm kind of going to skip over the crimes a little bit. I'll touch on them briefly. I do that for a couple of reasons. One, in an effort to sort of be aware of situations that folks in this room might have gone through, that sensitive language might be triggering for some. And additionally, we're not focused on the crime, which I think that when we hear these super emotional and very potentially triggering stories of domestic violence, we can focus in on that instead of what we're really here maybe to think about, which is corporate social responsibility. So that being said, no, okay, that's fine.
I have a clicker.
You know, that's okay. We'll figure it out. So we'll start with an overview of what corporate social responsibility is. Like I said, we'll touch on those cases pretty quickly, and then really dive into the findings in the discussion as well as some potential future applications based off of those findings that I have seen in the way that the NFL handles its domestic violence instances. So, in 1953, Howard Bowen described corporate social responsibility as the various obligations of businesses executives to pursue policies, make decisions, or follow lines of actions that are aligned with the values of the greater society. Later building off of that, Davis in 1960 theorized corporate social responsibility as decisions and actions taken for reasons at least partially beyond the firm's direct economic interests. So a lot of ways this manifests in environmental efforts or community efforts, something that is bigger or more important or at least recognizes the bottom, farther along than the bottom line of a company. So the research questions guiding my project were, how does the NFL respond to acts of domestic violence perpetrated by players? And then how do they respond, how do these responses that the NFL has reflect back on their corporate social responsibility efforts? Oh, we're working again. I love that. So, touching on the cases very quickly, I used three that occurred between 2014 and 2016. The first being Baltimore Ravens player Ray Rice, if we're familiar with what happened. Important fact to note, video evidence of him committing the assault was obtained and was released. Greg Hardy is an interesting domestic violence case because it wasn't the first time he was arrested for it, and he was found guilty by a judge. He appealed it, and then later his bench trial never occurred. She ended up dropping the case. And then finally, Josh Brown, who had kept a detailed diary of the instances that he had abused his wife of, where he had expressed sentiments of being God over her and feeling as though he had the power to do whatever he wanted. And so throughout each of these cases, it's important to note that the NFL's sentiments were, man, that's really bad. We're going to look into that. We're going to look into that for you and we'll get back to you. However, after they said that, all of these men were allowed to play again. In the offseason, so if we're just going to break it down really quick, the NFL's social responsibility report outlines a 6-game minimum suspension for any player accused or under investigation of domestic violence. 6-game minimum. Initially, Greg Hardy received that, and then as soon as he appealed his bench decision, he was eligible, so he only missed 2 games. Ray Rice was in a similar situation where it was initially he was suspended, and then as soon as he appealed it, he was allowed to play. And then Josh Brown's, I think, would be the least familiar to anyone because it was so quiet. Josh Brown was a kicker. And so during his investigation, which took place during the offseason, Josh Brown actually signed a contract extension. So not a ton of abiding by their own rules on the part of the NFL, we could say, regardless of the evidence in the videos or the diaries or the actual guilty verdict that was put on these men at the time. So I used a purposive sampling method, which is basically just searching with a function. I have a purpose for looking for what I'm looking for. So what I did was I took data about the NFL's corporate social responsibility directly from their reports. I looked really closely at any released statements on the part of Roger Goodell, coaching staff, and the players themselves, and then some popular media sources such as the New York Times, Time Magazine, Sports Illustrated. And then as well, and this is where purposive sampling comes in, a keyword search with like domestic violence, Greg Hardy, NFL, to narrow that down. So, what we found, and this is a lot of information on one side, so I'm going to break it up a little bit, is that the NFL itself, in 2016, reports that domestic violence isn't okay. And so what the NFL is going to do is they're going to work with national hotlines to provide resources for victims and survivors. They're not going to tolerate it within their organizations at any level. So this is where the 6-game minimum suspension comes in. They have a joint task force with their legal team and different police entities. But then they sort of backtrack at the very end and they say, but mitigating circumstances could affect that 6-game minimum. So that's where we're leaving that. But as I did my analysis, I found 3 major themes. The first quoted here by a coach of one of the players saying, he's our guy. And so that's a resonating theme that if you play well on the field, what you do off of the field doesn't matter as much. And that can be sort of validated in the fact that a lot of other professional football players have been accused or arrested for domestic violence instances, but never of the actual on-field importance that those 3 have, because those ones were cut immediately. If you follow the Denver Broncos, one of their quarterbacks was cut after a similar violent situation this year because he hadn't played at all. And so they're like, okay, this liability is too much. However, players with more impactful team participation are shown more public support by fans. They're shown more public support by their teams, as well as the NFL commissioner himself. Speaking of the NFL commissioner, Roger Goodell, who's been in that position since 2006, sort of the head honcho of the entire organization, is who these cases come to. He ultimately decides whether or not they're suspended. So as of October 2014, 16 of the cases that I looked at committed by NFL players didn't have any ban imposed at all. 14 carried a suspension of 1 game, and that included Josh Brown. 18 were diverted to anger management problem, and 12 were settled out of court. Therefore, Roger Goodell dropped them as well. Because they were dropped in court, they were dropped by the league. And then finally, looking at the cases a little bit farther down the road, players generally don't take responsibility. Sentiments of it not being my fault on the part of the NFL, the players, and the coaching staff come through in a lot of the interviews. So NFL executives and players have been shown to engage in practices of victim blaming. One of the cases that I used after the fact, the reporter questioned him and he said, well, if I did anything wrong, my bad, and left it at that. If I did anything wrong, my bad. But for the most part, they remained silent. And the NFL also generally doesn't apologize for any mishandling of these cases as well. So what do we do with this? I guess it was the question that I was circling around. And I think it raises an issue around corporate social responsibility relating to promise versus practice. So the NFL, this is from its social responsibility board, says the league aims to use its platform to work towards changing long-standing social norms, including the shame, blame, and general unwillingness on the part to discuss these issues, being domestic violence and sexual assault, out in the open. And I think this is funny in a way to look at because it says it aims. It never says it's going to make itself do it. It says, well, we're going to work on it. We'll get to it. But then in practice, we can see that their actions don't necessarily line up with creating a more progressive, open, and consistent culture, even within their own organization. NFL is still struggling with this problem. These are some recent cases of domestic violence in the NFL. Reuben Foster was arrested on violent assault and domestic assault charges, both in April and November. He lost his job on one team and was immediately signed to another, the Washington Redskins. And then Kareem Hunt of the Kansas City Chiefs was also caught on video assaulting a woman, and it took a little bit longer that time for him to get a job, but he did re-sign with the team a few weeks ago, the Cleveland Browns. So as we look at this over a span of years, and as maybe throughout the entirety of the league, you can see that not a ton is changing. You know, it might cost you your job for whatever reason, or it might cost you a game or two, but if you're good enough, you'll be back. A team will believe in you, you will be their guy. So, in identifying identifying the ways that corporate social responsibility is disconnected between the policy and the practice, a different vantage point on CSR can be examined through communication, the way that efforts are articulated, practiced, and then communicated about throughout organizations and between them. CSR in sport particularly is important because sport is such a big part of culture. It is especially important when we think of the lessons that kids learn, both implicitly and through actually engaging with sport directly, in teaching healthy behaviors, particularly. In the NFL and football itself are criticized for a multitude of things. But domestic violence and violence against women being accepted is just one of those things I think that we can talk about. So in recognizing that sport has become a cultural pillar of identity, consumption, and influence, we can see the need to continue studying sports organizations and their social responsibility efforts. So, to revisit, my paper focused mostly on what is the NFL doing when players are convicted, caught, accused of sexual assault, and how does the way that they handle it reflect back on their social responsibility efforts. And this is the conclusion I came to, is that a clear contradiction exists between the pledge to support community through social responsibility efforts and the actions that the league takes when it happens. This calls into question the value that the NFL places on its stakeholders, namely its women and children as community members that might be going through this. So I spent a lot of time telling you what's wrong with the NFL and that it sucks and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, I still watch football on Sundays. I do. And so, that being said, no critical research is complete without suggestions for improvement. So the NFL Players Association, or NFLPA, is sort of the union for players and athletes, oftentimes at odds with the league office itself. However, if the two can find a unified front in some way, I think that would be one approach in taking a unified front that the union's not going to have your back if you're doing your work. It's just not, we're not about that anymore. And setting that standard early. And then finally, NFL makes billions of dollars a year. They have resources that they can use, past just printing. And here's the domestic violence hotline, once every season in a commercial. They have legal counsel, community presence, and financial power. This can be seen through efforts on the part of players. The NFL makes a really big deal of Walter Payton Man of the Year, the man in the NFL that gives back to his community and engages in great on and off-field conduct. And they spend a lot of money recognizing that man. And so if the league were to take that responsibility to be a community pillar as seriously as some of its players already do, I think that the norms, the expectations of athletes, and the way that they interact with community members and women and their domestic partners might change as well. That being said, again, what's wrong? What's wrong? There's always more that's wrong. There's always more to talk about. And so the ways that can manifest is continued research on the frequency of NFL players in domestic violence, which is really hard because it's always happening. It never stops. Like I said, I was getting ready for this presentation and I was panicking because there were so many more. I was like, these are from 2014, there's so many more. A deeper analysis of organizational and fan responses if any decline is happening as far as the hit them where it hurts in their pocketbook approach to analyzation. Kind of touched in here with the financial leadership. And then finally, instances of domestic violence in the NFL can't be disconnected from their potential to be related to traumatic brain injury. And so research on frequency of concussions as it correlates to frequency for violent behavior may be beneficial to look at in a longer term project as well. That's all.